Let's talk to Tom Pope, who's Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. Tom, welcome here to the programme. In terms of the variety of bills we've seen outlined, what do you make of what you've heard when it comes to growth?
I think it was a really impressive set of measures. Not much of it, if any of it, was new. This is something that Labour in opposition and during the campaign and even in the first week or two of government have been really clear about, that growth will be a priority. I think it was notable that once again the growth mission was set up as the main thing this government is going to be trying to do. Of the bills that were announced, I think the planning reforms are by far the most significant and most fleshed out bit of what the government's trying to do. Most of that really was backing up or confirming what Rachel Reeves said in her speech last week, a commitment to reintroducing planning targets, making various reforms there. With that bill and others, we'll need to see the detail before we know exactly how radical it is. But I think what's really important here is that the government is on the front foot about it. It knows that planning is one of those things that's going to be really controversial. It's trying to deliver early while it has a mandate to do so. And it also knows it's something that will take a while to deliver. It's not something that's going to suddenly boost GDP growth to 2 or 3% this year or next, but it's something that over the long term could make a meaningful difference.
Yes, housing is one of the critical drivers, but they talk about bulldozing through planning restrictions, the sort of thing that have held previous governments back. But realistically, how long does that take to change the variety of planning laws that are currently in place?
Well, Rachel Reeves last week suggested an intention to move pretty quickly. So they're going to produce a draft new version of the National Planning Policy Framework, which before recess, which is the document that sets out things like the rules that local plans need to submit to, what local planning targets might be. There are also other things that they can do more quickly. So, for example, Rachel Reeves said that she'd be willing to call in decisions, effectively override some local objections to both housing and infrastructure development, that you can do more quickly. I think in terms of a fundamental reform of how the system's operating on the ground, that does take longer. This is a complicated area. You need to take the time to get the legislation right. So we probably are looking at a year or two before you really start to see big changes in, for example, the number of houses that are built. And that's also true because the supply side, construction and so on needs time to ramp up and develop and identify those new sites that are going to be newly permitted. So again, we're not talking about something that you're suddenly going to see a lot more construction going on in 6 months or so, but it's something that over the next 2 years, 3 years, you could start to see a meaningful difference. And I think what this government will be hoping is that by moving quickly and moving early, it's something that certainly by the time of the next election, not only have you started to see some of the initial effects in terms of more houses, more infrastructure being built, but you're also starting to see some of the growth dividend of that as well.
Aside from housing, though, take me through what you anticipate the likely pitfalls or potential gaps are, because every economy, every European economy wants to flick a switch, get growth going. It is significantly harder than that. We've seen all these measures that hope to trigger growth, but what do you think are the potential gaps still?
I think the biggest challenge is just that there's a limit to how much government policy can suddenly spur on growth. There aren't lots of silver bullets that lead to short-term growth. There are lots of things that we think over the longer term should promote a better performing economy and get more growth. A good planning system is one, more public investment and private investment is another, and you also look at the skills system. All of those things promote growth in the longer term. I think public investment is one area that could be a real challenge. The government has announced some specific areas where it wants to invest more. The National Wealth Fund, which is legislated for, or is announced as further legislation today, is one aspect of that. But while they're able to point to specific areas where they'll invest more, the overall plans that this government has signed up to, as was set out by Jeremy Hunt in the last budget, implies actually quite big cuts to public investment over the next few years. And so there's some rhetoric about more investment in some places, but that's going to mean, if they stick to those plans, some difficult choices about investing less in other areas. And that could be things like the public sector estate, hospitals and schools. And that's an area already where we see crumbling infrastructure and that we see impacts on the productivity of public services, that more money is going in, but we're not getting more out of it. And actually, that's also a problem for growth as well, if we have a less well-educated, a less healthy workforce.
We'll come to some of that backdrop. Ben Chu has done a very interesting piece at BBC Verify on just the state of the public purse. So we'll come to that in a moment or two. But in terms of, we've had inflation figures out today. They've stayed the same within the target of 2%. Is that a point of optimism in terms of that fundamental question of when people start to feel a bit better off?
It's certainly much better to be having inflation at 2% than up towards 10% as we did 18 months or so ago. It's important to note that it's not something that people will necessarily see in their pocket straight away. Lower inflation just means that prices are not going up as quickly as they were before, not that they're falling back to previous levels. So we will still see that people are looking in the shops or looking at their rental bills perhaps and seeing that they're much higher than they were 18 months ago, and in many cases that their wages have not kept pace. Nonetheless, it's definitely a more stable economic environment on which Labour will hope to build with the bills here, and we'll look forward to a budget at some point in the autumn where Rachel Reeves will have a chance to set out those plans in more detail.
Yes.
There'll also be a decision for the Bank of England to make at their next meeting, certainly the meeting in August is when you'd next expect them to make a decision about whether to start reducing interest rates as well.
A final thought then, because you mentioned the budget. Were you glad to see a new bill, tough new fiscal rules about needing to have an OBR assessment before you have a major fiscal statement like a budget? We all saw what happened with Liz Truss's budget when she didn't do that, and a bill to address exactly that, so we don't get a repetition of that.
I think it's really welcome. I think it was the very first bill in the King's Speech, indeed, and that does indicate, I think, a commitment towards independent institutions like the OBR, but also towards not making policy on the hoof or making it too quickly. You rightly point out that this was announced originally in response to the debacle of the mini-budget. And I think this, alongside other things that Rachel Reeves is committed to, including only having one main fiscal event per year rather than at least two, as we've tended to have, and also setting out a strategy for tax on business, which she's expected to unveil soon as well. All of that is about committing to a more certain, more stable environment that should be beneficial both for businesses and families, and particularly important on business investment, because as we mentioned, public investment is set to be very tight, so driving growth is going to need to come to a great extent through greater involvement of the private sector, and a more certain, stable business environment is a really important part of that.
Tom Pope, great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us here on the programme.